Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Matthew Stewart, whose book, Nature's God, The Heretical Origins of the American Republic, is going to provoke some interesting discussion, I'm sure. Mr. Stewart is the author of the books The Courtier and the Heretic, Leibniz, Spinoza, and the Fate of God in the Modern World, and The Management Myth, Debunking the Modern Philosophy of Business. He lives in Boston, Massachusetts. Mr. Stewart, welcome to the program.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
This book makes a solid case through logic, rebuttal, and dialectic, examining some of the philosophers of the Enlightenment era and contemporary thinking, that our founding fathers had no intention of creating a Christian republic, and that in fact they were much more influenced by empiricism, and we've seen in many history books the reference to deism. You refer also to pantheism and immanence. And I used to think those three words were pretty much synonymous, immanence and deism and pantheism. And you equate those with atheism. And I'd just like to see if you can somehow package all that up and explain it to us and make some distinctions for us between those words, immanence and deism and pantheism.
Well, that's great. So you bring up a lot of really interesting issues. And I guess I should say at the start that there's no easy path through all of this. I don't think you can come up with a one-line statement about what the founders intended and what the Great American Experiment is all about. But let's start at the beginning. Founders' intentions are very important. I think it's very important to figure out what these people were thinking, what kind of resources they were using. But at the same time, I don't think that we need to follow every whim that they had, and I also don't imagine that we can know exactly what they intended or that they had a coherent set of intentions. So it's important to figure out what was going on and what influenced them, but all that is just so that we can understand ourselves a little bit better. The main point I want to communicate to a wider audience is that America's founders drew on an incredibly rich philosophical heritage. So they were incredibly well-read. I mean, they were saying the kinds of things that no political leader today will say, simply because today's political leaders wouldn't understand what it is that they're saying. I mean, when Thomas Jefferson says, I am an Epicurean, this is a profound and interesting statement from him. If a modern American leader said it, we would probably guess that he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I want to draw attention to this very rich heritage. Now, what is in that heritage, and how does it relate to these questions that you raised about deism, pantheism, atheism, and all that? I think there's a kind of simple idea that's percolated through American history that the founders were deists, and deism was just a kind of lukewarm theological doctrine, and something about believing in a deity who creates the universe, but then more or less walks away to the sound of ticking noises.
The watchmaker.
The watchmaker God idea. And there's some of that in the history, but I'm a primary source kind of guy. I want to go back and see what they were actually writing and what they were actually reading. And it turns out to be much more complex than that. Deism was really more like a way of life. It was a whole basket of connected doctrines. And the theological part, whether there is a God or not and what that God is like, in some ways is just a kind of symptom of this broader package. So to some degree, I mean, this will sound very strange, but I don't think that the question about the existence of God is actually particularly important in the deist context. In fact, many of them basically say, of course there's a God. We're deists and we believe that there's a deity and there's absolutely no question, and you can't possibly be an atheist, right? It's incoherent, according to them,
right,
to imagine that you could be an atheist. But that doesn't take us very far, because then the next question, which many people in the 18th century asked, is, well, what does it mean then to say that you believe in God? What is the nature of this thing you believe in? And that's where you find the real difficulty. And that's where I think you can start to draw connections with these other bodies of thought that we call pantheism or atheism or immanence. Because when you get to the core of the deist conception, you find that a lot of the other beliefs, the other key commitments that come with it, are pretty indistinguishable from what comes with pantheism and what comes with atheism. So let me summarize deism without referring to a deity. If you're a deist, then you're someone like this man who called himself the natural man of Boston. He published this sermon called A Sermon on Natural Religion. He published it anonymously in 1770. He says, if you're a natural man, meaning a deist, then you are someone who acts according to reason. Everything you do, you hold up to the standard of reason. Now, implicit in that, of course, is the idea that you don't accept the authority of any kind of revelation, right? So that's a crucial commitment to reason. A second basic commitment that he makes is that you are committed to nature, or to explaining things in a natural way. That is to say, when you commit yourself to reason, you're committing yourself to the notion that things in nature are intelligible. That in a way, that the miraculous thing about nature is that there are no miracles, that causes follow effects, and that everything within our world of experience we can explain through these laws of nature, laws of science, through real investigation, and not through strange mystical inspirations and so on. And then a final point is that you're also committed to the basic idea that the world doesn't exist to serve us and our particular purposes, that we are a part of the world. And the way that the natural man expresses this is to say, well, I believe that the universe goes on forever. There's lots of planets, and they're probably inhabited just like us. There's space aliens everywhere, and we aren't anything special. We can make ourselves special by understanding the world. So those things are all part of it. And a final point I'd make about deism is that it's committed to this idea that there is a sense of piety. There's a sense of something sacred or divine, but it's all bound up with the idea of leading a virtuous life. So whatever there is in religion, its only value shows up in virtue and living a virtuous life. So those are, I think, ideas of deism. And yes, they are in the package of deism. They're associated with this weird watchmaker theology. But in a way, that becomes kind of unimportant. And it's in that sense that they are pretty close to atheism or pantheism and those other isms.
I do want to explore that a little further, especially with the definition of virtue from this perspective. But I wanted to touch on some of these founding fathers because of the influence they had and the way you bring them up in terms of their own philosophy. I want to get to, for sure, Ethan Allen, who was kind of the Chuck Norris of our founding fathers, and also Thomas Young, who was quite the intellectual and probably didn't get all the credit he was doing Thomas Paine. But I'm turning to Jefferson first for obvious reasons. I mean, the writing of the Declaration, his enormous collection of books, and his statement that I think is really pertinent here to nature's God versus orthodox God, because he said something about his opposition to the tyranny over the minds of men. And one of the points that you make is that it isn't just political tyranny, but it's actually religious orthodox tyranny. And, of course, in the 17th and 18th centuries, orthodoxy was not real kind to heretics and blasphemers. So
that's right. And I think that one writing of Jefferson's that everyone should really read is one of the very last letters that he composed. It was in 1826. And someone asked him on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, what was the real meaning of the Declaration of Independence? And his words are really quite striking, because he says, I hope it will be a signal to arouse men to break the chains of monkish superstition that had persuaded them to bind themselves and to believe that the many are destined to be ruled by the few. So he's really conflating and very consciously conflating two different kinds of liberation here. He's saying you need to liberate yourselves from monkish superstition, which is basically a code word for Orthodox religion, at the same time that you liberate yourself from political oppression, because those two things are intimately connected. And he says that is the point of the Declaration of Independence. So, Jefferson was quite a radical revolutionary character. I don't think he spoke for all Americans, but we had a philosopher-in-chief at that point, and he made a difference. He put a stake in the ground that ultimately has had big, major consequences, I think, for all of us to the present.
Yeah, on this program, we have interviewed the Smithsonian publishers of Jefferson's Bible. And I remember that he cut and pasted in 4 different languages the passages that he thought were germane, and he didn't include the miracles, because as you explore in the book, at some point the empiricists influenced the thoughts about miracles as something that basically we just don't know how to explain.
Yes, the story is pretty well known, but I want to add one element to it that I draw attention to in my book. So the basic story is that, yes, Jefferson believed that there was something very important in Jesus' teaching, and that important thing was the moral teaching. Mm-hmm. And the rest he thought was basically, literally, he said, a dunghill. So he was extracting these pearls of moral wisdom from the dunghill of miracles and other superstitious prophetic claims. Now, the point I want to make in the book is that this basic move has a long prehistory, and you can find it in the books that Jefferson was collecting and that he said were very important to him. Books by people like Joseph Priestley, but then before that, John Locke, and before that, Spinoza, and before that, Giordano Bruno. So there is this basic gesture that Jefferson makes, which is quite radical and disconcerting, taking scissors to the Bible. It's really the culmination of a very particular philosophical tradition. So we owe a lot to that tradition, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've mentioned so far some of the philosophers that you weave threads throughout the book, Epicurus, Locke, Bruno, Spinoza. And one of the things I notice is that you're not fond of the way that Locke talks out of both sides of his mouth. He seems to take a stand on one side and then the other as well. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I try not to be fond or not fond of these dead philosophers because, they are what they are. Mm-hmm. And let me say that in some ways, John Locke performed a very important service in my mind. Mm-hmm. So the basic picture I want to present is that John Locke is someone who grasped the core of radical philosophy that was coming down from Spinoza, and from before Spinoza, Bruno, and Epicurus. So John Locke himself was, in some really important way, quite radical. But in a sense, he was so radical that he understood that many of the people around him would not be willing to listen to a message that was couched in the same radical terms that his predecessors used. So he learned how to, in some ways, speak out of two sides of his mouth. But I don't think it's necessarily duplicitous or hypocritical, because he was essentially trying to give them a bridge that would sort of take them over to a greater degree of enlightenment or understanding without provoking hostile or defensive reaction. And this is the basic story of deism in the American Revolution. A term like nature's God, it comes out of the deist tradition. There's no real question that it is at its heart and its origin. It's this radical doctrine that kind of equates God with nature. But precisely because it uses the term God and because it's surrounded with this kind of pious language, it can be interpreted in many different ways, and it does not appear to be nearly as threatening as a claim that that we owe everything just to inanimate nature, right? So I think John Locke plays a really crucial role in the history, and I wouldn't, as I say, I don't want to say I like him or dislike him, but I think that we should respect that particular role that he played.
Yes. And he definitely articulates a point of view with some degree of clarity in his poetry from time to time. You mentioned that as well. It's just that he's doing something that there's a suggestion that some of the guys who survived as the most prominent figures of our founding father history, Jefferson and Franklin, learned the art of verbal avoidance of being proclaimed a heretic or a blasphemer in the strongest sense. I think it was, you mentioned Ben Franklin learning to stoop at an early age, and that's a nice story too.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and that's why Ethan Allen and Thomas Young, for me, were so fascinating. I mean, I started this project 10 years ago. I came from a kind of background in the history of ideas, but not necessarily American ideas, and Ethan Allen and Thomas Young, they're minor figures in the course of the revolution, but they are major in what they reveal. It turns out that really what someone like Thomas Young was articulating is the same thing that Jefferson was articulating and the same thing that Benjamin Franklin was articulating. They shared the same radical deist philosophy. The difference is that Thomas Young was a rabble-rouser. He was a person who spoke his mind. One of my favorite stories that I uncovered at the New York Public Library, they have all these letters that were written in connection with the Boston Committee of Correspondence, on which Young served. and he was branded as an infidel, and people wrote in saying, how can you have this horrible atheist on your committee? And the members of the committee wrote back these very touching letters where they said, well, you're kind of right about Thomas Young. But the thing is that he's got friends everywhere. He really gets along with people, despite the fact that everywhere he goes, he says exactly what he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
So he's this figure who is very useful to a historian, because he gets to the bottom of it and really says what this deist philosophy was all about. But that what makes him interesting in a way is that he's sort of Thomas Jefferson without the fancy clothes and without the slaves and all that. He's kind of the sort of authentic philosophical core of Jefferson and Franklin and Paine, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Now, he doesn't get his due in American history books typically, but Dr. Thomas Young, obviously, based upon your discussion here, I've become more impressed with what an impact he had. You mentioned a rabble rouser. He's an instigator of the Tea Party, and he vaccinated people when that was not considered a good idea all the time, and he influenced Ethan Allen a great deal, and had to run at some point from the British, from Rhode Island.
Well, what's particularly striking is the way that he was able to do this across a number of colonies. I mean, if you look back at that period, the North American continent was divided into these colonies, and there were very substantial differences among the colonies. And just the idea that they could all have a common interest, that they could work together, that in itself was a kind of radical innovation. And Thomas Young was at the very forefront of that. I mean, he seemed to understand in the 1760s already that there could be a revolutionary project. It could involve liberating North America, not just from Britain, but from the entire monarchical system, and that you could bring the entire continent together around that. So he shows up in New York, where he leads the Stamp Act riots. He shows up in Boston, where he's a key figure in the Boston Tea Party. And then, amazingly, the most important thing is he shows up in Philadelphia in 1776, where he leads this Pennsylvania Revolution, absolutely essential to the Declaration of Independence, and then is a co-author of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. Oh, and of course, he names the state of Vermont along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So, he's really got an incredible revolutionary pedigree, and it's not just an accident. He was... I was said a little dismissively he was a rabble rouser, but you're right to call me out on that, because, in fact, he was a key theorist of the revolution. You could call him an ideologue or you can call him a philosopher, but he was someone who thought about the nature and the direction of the revolution, and he clearly understood it in a way that he thought would bring people together from around the colonies and bring them around to a project of changing the world in a significant way. So I hope I can bring him back to life a little bit. I hope people will pay a little more attention to this forgotten founder.
Yeah, his loyal sidekick, Ethan Allen, is a character that I want to talk about, especially in the context of what you said about the differences in the colonies, because he was of the Green Mountain, Vermont, and he was something of a drinking carouser who was a mountain of a man who was kind of feisty when he needed to be, and he really started his first battle against tyranny was against the Yorkers, who wouldn't let him have his property rights.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I remember Ethan Allen from the schoolboy stories, and I loved him. I loved those stories about the Green Mountain boys out there sneaking into Fort Ticonderoga. I don't know if you remember that. When they took it over, the British commander came out in his pajamas,
right.
and Ethan Allen, comes up with a bombastic statement. Hand over the fort now in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. I mean, this is great stuff, and I love that. He was certainly a mountain man. He could hoot like an owl, and he could chase down deer. But this is what I found out 10 years ago, is that he thought of himself as something a great deal more interesting, as a philosopher. He wrote this very long book on philosophy, and like his friend Thomas Young, he was someone who just spoke his mind. And so that makes him a really interesting character, because he's got that kind of rough-hewn, very American thing, but he's also a genuine thinker and someone who is not going to be held back in his thought. And he paid a certain price for that, because his thinking turned out to be pretty incompatible with most versions of the established religion.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it also turned out to be really interesting for me as a historian of philosophy, because even though Ethan Allen was completely self-taught, he basically said, I don't read books.
Mm-hmm.
He, nonetheless, in his book, was able to reproduce all of these interesting, fascinating arguments that you can trace back in the history of philosophy to previous philosophers. And I'm not talking about sort of general speculative concepts, but very specific arguments, phrases, vocabulary, and so on. And there's no question that he must have gotten that in conversation, and almost no question that the main conversational partner he had was his buddy Thomas Young.
Yeah, you mentioned Thomas Young. Some people wanted to attribute Ethan Allen's, what we call Ethan Allen's Bible in the book, to Thomas Young, and you provide some evidence that probably is not the case, but that if somebody else wrote it, it wasn't Thomas Young.
Yeah, well, that's how I came to this story 10 years ago. That the reigning theory was that Ethan Allen was just too much of a mountain man, too uneducated to have written a 477-page book. Somebody else must have written it. So this claim was put out there. It started in the mid-19th century that Ethan Allen stole a book from Thomas Young. And I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. This will make a nice detective story, the story of the stolen book and so on. But then as I read deeper into the material, it became clear that this theory had no real basis. It was just a speculation made in the mid-19th century and sort of left unquestioned since then. I think the real motivation for it was that Ethan Allen, you couldn't get rid of him from the history. He was too important. But he was this infidel, and so how do you deal with this successful infidel, this impious founder? And the way you deal with it is by saying, well, he was just too dumb to have actually written what he supposedly wrote, so he wasn't an infidel. He was just a mountain man, and we'll leave it at that. But I'm grateful for the theory because it introduced me to Thomas Young, and then it turned out Thomas Young had his own writings, and then I discovered an anonymous pamphlet. I referred to it earlier, this pamphlet by Natural Man. I'm fairly convinced that the author of that was, in fact, Thomas Young. So Thomas Young didn't write Ethan Allen's Bible, but he did write this Sermon on Natural Religion, and that is in itself also quite interesting and revealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think we could eliminate Ethan Allen from history anyway after a furniture company decided to name themselves after him. But
yeah, but that was a great injustice because, Ethan Allen, as you mentioned, spent his early career fighting New Yorkers, and then it was a pair of New York businessmen who decided to name their furniture company the Ethan Allen Furniture Company. So it's a great irony of history. That one.
Let's see if we can extract a little bit from the philosophy discussion that you have, how some of the most important ideas evolved. You have a chapter on self-evident truths, and that all men are created equal is the big one, and the critical role of things like in the Constitution, like the free press and the guarantees of freedom of religion, and the constitutional government's power to enhance human power and freedom, being really significant to and emerging out of the philosophy of the Age of Enlightenment.
Yes, that's right. I guess the key theoretical agenda I have is to try to figure out as well as I can where these basic principles of American government come from. The idea that we're all created equal, the idea that we have certain unalienable rights, the idea that government somehow has to answer to the consent of the governed. So, what's their real foundation? And of course, there are plenty of histories that can tie it back to some specific philosophers, and John Locke is certainly the one who kind of should and does come to the fore in most explanations. But I guess when I read that philosophical prehistory and I try to understand the concepts as deeply as I can, I think that that these principles do have a deeper foundation, and that foundation goes beyond just a kind of declaration of some abstract truths that we all happen to agree on. I think that the equality, rights, and democracy all really originate from this very basic commitment that begins with ancient Greek philosophy to accept only the guidance of reason. So once you make this commitment to understand the world through reason, that is, to accept that everything in nature is intelligible, that then commits you to a set of insights about the nature of the human mind, the nature of knowledge, who we are. And it also commits you to explaining power in a certain way, the way in which people can and do accumulate power over one another. And it also leads you to explain morality and virtue in a certain way. So all of those things, I think, originate from this radical commitment to the guiding principle of philosophy or reason, and they can provide, and they do provide, historically, a very strong foundation for these basic principles of American government. And while some of that gets very abstract, and the philosophy of mind, in particular, you mentioned the chapter on self-evident truth. I have to admit it can get kind of gnarly in there. The basic consequences are really straightforward. John Adams made one of the fundamental conclusions very clear. He just said, in this new American government, everything is founded on reason. Mm-hmm. We do not base anything on words coming down from a dove from on high, or a vial of holy oil, or anything like that. This is a government founded on reason and experience. And I think that is that ultimately is a very simple truth that comes down from America's founders.
And that phrase, self-evident truths, that you mentioned, and that this ties right into what you were saying. Jefferson's original draft was sacred and undeniable, and Franklin suggested they change that because it serves to alert us that there will be no appeal to truths handed down from scriptures or announced prophets. There will be reasons for beliefs, not beliefs without reasons. And I think that's a beautiful cap on that particular chapter.
That's right. I think that is the core message. And by the way, Jefferson's initial phrasing of sacred and undeniable has an important element to it as well. It's just harder to capture, and it's this, that for people like Jefferson, this commitment to reason, to having to explain yourself, had a kind of sacred air. I mean, the pursuit of truth for Jefferson and for the deists in general was something that they saw as having a kind of higher purpose, or that was that's what they meant by true piety.
Mm-hmm. I've only got about 3 minutes, but I want to see if I can get to both happiness and virtue. The pursuit of happiness is a phrase that's in our sacred documents, and that actually comes down to us from Locke. And at one point you say there's more than a little historical irony to the fact that the pursuit of happiness has long taken to stand for thoughtless, selfish, amoral consumerism and materialism, but that's not really what was intended. It's more about the improvement of understanding.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because when you read the Declaration closely, and it's something close to its original language, you see that it's a much deeper and more profound document than we give it credit for. And the pursuit of happiness is really the best case in point. Yes, we tend to see that as just shallow hedonism. Go to the shopping mall and buy as many goodies as you can, and drink heavily through the night, something like that. No, in the actual history, the pursuit of happiness, that phrase, the basic concept, came with the understanding that the proper way to achieve happiness is to pursue the truth, and it is to basically improve your understanding of the world, and to, through that understanding, improve your collaboration, your cooperation with your fellow human beings. So it's a very rich, philosophically sophisticated concept of happiness. It's one that emphasizes virtue, and it emphasizes wisdom. In some ways, it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Socrates, right? It's happiness, it's virtue, it's wisdom. And that's what's in our Declaration of Independence, not this kind of shallow celebration of consumer culture.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time. There's so much more to this book. Is rich, and the people who have written about it mention that it is splendid, imaginative, that it's lively and powerful, and I found it to be so from cover to cover. It's a interesting blend of ideas and thought and history. And the book we've been talking about is Nature's God, The Heretical Origins of the American Republic by Matthew Stewart. I want to remind our listeners that if you don't catch our show in the 4 times it airs, Thursdays 12 to 12:30 and 12:30 to 1, and Sundays 6:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m., you can catch us on YouTube. Just Google YouTube and look on the search engine for Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook, and you'll find this recorded there as well as many other of our recent books. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening, and thanks to our sponsor, audiobooks.com.